Hello, thank you for joining me. This is going to be, I think, a bit of a quick one. I've not had any kind of huge book hauls in the last few weeks. I've got a problem with space now. I've got too much. I need to sort of jettison some of this. And I'm sure a few of you have this issue that you don't want to let go of anything. We're a bit retentive with these things, even some trashy Jackie Collins thing. Oh no, I can't. It starts off with oh, is this worth anything on eBay? I don't think so in the case of that. But and then maybe I'll get around. No, you got to cut some stuff loose, and admittedly, struggling with that. So I've kind of held off from the acquisitions up to a point lately. However, I couldn't stop myself. I was in a record shop a few weeks back and they still had some signed by the author copies. I missed the event, but the autobiography or the memoirs of Budgie, Susie and the Banshees and Creatures fame. Now, to my shame, actually, I've only ever saw the Banshees once, which was a gig that was rather regrettably cut short. This would have been in 1982. I was still school age. A few of us went to see Susie and the Banshees in Southampton. It was just at that point that John McGeoch had been sidelined, as it was described at the time, that he was suffering from nervous exhaustion, which I'm assuming was kind of music business language for something else. But so, between them sort of releasing the album, Kiss in the Dream House would have been the album, and actually doing the tour dates, they called back Robert Smith of The Cure, who at the time, The Cure had kind of, they were kind of considered a bit of a blown, they were kind of considered yesterday's papers at that point. There was no prospect that The Cure were going to go on and become this kind of massive stadium band. The Cure was considered kind of done business, and Robert Smith, it seemed, I suppose, to many like his best option. Oh yeah, just jump in and fill the guitar slot with the Banshees. You'll be playing at bigger crowds, and that kind of, the Banshees being the bigger band at the time. But anyway, this gig in Southampton, you had factions at audiences in those days, punk, post-punk, as people refer to that period now. It wasn't a terribly unified crowd. You had factions at gigs that, there were people you didn't want to stand terribly near. And it got kind of rowdy, unpleasant at this gig. I mean, I'm not even talking about a skinhead sort of presence, because you would still get these. And when I say skinhead, I necessarily mean your kind of ska-loving followers of the, in its original late 60s, I suppose, sense. I don't think too many of those guys were at this gig, but it was kind of within that sort of punk thing, that people have very different mindsets. And I think some people wanted that gig to be a pogo sort of unreconstructed class of 77 thing, which of course the Banshees weren't by that point. They had a very different lineup, Budgie included. He was a later addition. Anyway, long and short was people were still spitting at gigs back then, and Susie wasn't receptive to that. Someone hit her with a bit of gob, and she walked off the stage, came back in. She'd obviously seen who'd done it and pointed the guy out. And the place, we were kind of probably 15, 16 years old. We just ran for the exits. It was like, yeah, this gig's not happening now. It's just get away before this fight just escalates too far. So that was it. We maybe got about 7 or 8 songs into it. So yeah, but Budgie on the drums, very captivating drum style the guy had. He'd previously played with I believe Big in Japan. I've not got too far into this, admit. I was still in this childhood period as far as I've got into this, but we had a background with Big in Japan, and which I think featured Holly Johnson. I've got this right, from Frankie Goes to Hollywood. And then famously with the Slits, before joining the Banshees, at the point where drummer Kenny Morris and guitarist John Mackay famously jumped ship in 1979. I incidentally have had the privilege of getting to meet John Mackay recently. He's back doing the rounds. He's been out there again playing. Very nice to see. Really interesting guy to talk to. Actually, he does actually spoke quite highly of Budgie. I think from what I gathered, John then on the promotional jaunt for this, John Mackay went along to one of the signings and said hello, and no kind of bad blood between those two apparently. So, but anyway, so yeah, I do enjoy a good rock biog, and there has been a bit of a glut of them recently, but from that sort of period, related to that sort of period, but all good stuff, all really, really well written. I do think meaning to get round to some of the others. I do have a bit of a stack of, from the last 4 or 5 years anyway, really, really good sort of punk period rock biographies have been in mode. But anyway, so jumping tracks here. Now, I'm conscious we're in that kind of lead-up period to Remembrance Day, Armistice Day, Poppy Day, and I don't often get around to doing anything specific to it. I do always mean to. This isn't necessarily it. It just happens that I've been reading this or rereading it recently for the first time in many years. Theodor Plievier Stalingrad, which was the first of his Second World War novels, or documentary novel as it's sometimes described. It wasn't his first novel. He had written in the interwar years related to his, I believe, his First World War experiences in the Imperial German Navy. But this one, Plevier's history is unusual. I've touched on one of his books before, which would have been Moscow, which, although chronologically during the Second War timeline happens first, this, I think, was his first Second World War book. I think appeared in German probably not that long after the war, maybe late 40s. And it then got adapted, I think, either for German TV or for actual German film, and then an English language version of that was then produced. I haven't. I should check whether they may be on YouTube. I'm not sure. Have a look. I'll say something in the comments if I can find them. But now, yeah, there's some discussion I was reading recently, more relevant to First World War novels, but the idea that there are very few true anti-war novels, that even ones that are sort of generally read as anti-war novels, there's this idea of the nobility of suffering implicit within them, which some would argue is still not anti-war in its way. If I get time before November, the second Sunday or whenever it is in November, I'll get into that further. But anyway, this one, Plievier, he would have been, his observations would come from the Russian side, because he, as a German communist, had probably out of necessity really, jumped ship in the 1930s and relocated to the Soviet Union. I think he eventually got disillusioned with that as well. But, he, I think, was involved in the Soviet war effort as the intelligence, observation, interrogation side of things. So, yeah, it's not that he wasn't qualified to discuss these matters. It's just that he was doing it from a slightly unusual perspective. But you don't get any of the lead up. Normally a treatment of Stalingrad would get into the whole lead up, the campaign leading up to it throughout the summer of 1942. This starts on the day in November just before I think the 18th of November 1942, the day just before the big Russian encirclement happens. So it's for almost from the start, it's an absolute vision of hell. It's just horrible, and it's a book that needs to be horrible. It's a story that that needs pointing out, that there's no redeeming glory or valor. It's just awfulness. It's from the start very quickly gets into just absolute wretchedness of this situation. So there's this description in it of the kind of state people are in when they end up in these casualty stations, and it describes men with kind of open sores, and then the lice are feeding on the sores, and more in that vein. I have read this before many years ago. Revisit about halfway through. Now there are characters in this that I think are common to all three books, and there's a final one in the series, Berlin. I don't remember how the characters get out of this, because Stalingrad famously, once it was encircled, other than men who were a small amount who would have been airlifted out, either because of being too, in a state of injury that they couldn't be dealt with at casualty stations within the pocket, or they were airlifted out because their talents were deemed necessary elsewhere or something like that. But that would have been a very small minority. Not many people, and there were no. I think the modern historical thinking is that there were no bust outs. I think there used to be these kind of stories floating around that there had been, sort of little groups who'd fought their way out and made their way back to the Western lines. I don't think the modern historical understanding of it still entertains that idea. I know a Sven Hassel book kind of went into that, that had that as part of the plot. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe that's the case. So I think there's sort of 2 or 3 recurring characters throughout the books, Wilshofen and Knotke. I don't know. I can't remember how they get out of this in order to be in the third book. But, I suppose vaguely relevant to the time of year we're in. But it's a really, really harrowing read. And it's really something that needs to be. But anyway, that's all I got for tonight. Anyway, hopefully back soon with more in-depth. I'll try and do more focused, actually in-depth on a particular book. But anyway, thank you for joining me, and hopefully catch up soon.